So today I wanted to cover a topic that has been close to my heart for a long time. And as we're preparing to give the loud cry, we need to be prepared to live a self-sufficient lifestyle. And there's a lot of people which are certainly on the track to being being among the 144,000 and giving the loud cry. And they're following the health reform. But sometimes we get culture mixed up with health reform. And we begin to follow cultural practices that are not what God would have us do. And so I want to cover today kind of a sensitive topic, but something that I think is really important, and that is clothing. When we think about clothing, we want to be, inspiration tells us for want of food and clothing that they basically give up the message. And so we want to make sure that we are prepared for basically, preparing our own clothing, being self-sufficient in that manner. And to do that, there's several different ways to do that. One of them is to use linen. The other is to use wool. And if you could use one of those, the natural fibers that we have, we want to. Those will allow us to actually be able to prepare our own clothing in the end of time. And when it comes to leather, many times we have basically decided that leather is related to animal cruelty, therefore we will no longer use the material. And I think we need to use the Bible science, common sense type of way to look at things, just because many times we, even as plant-based individuals, we see that John the Baptist's diet was that of the end time, and he's a type for the end of time, and yet his diet was based on the carob bean and wild honey. And so we want to make sure that we don't discard the wild honey in the name of what we consider in modern terms as cruelty to animals. Okay, so certainly the Bible calls us to be stewards. He calls us to be kind to animals, but he also calls us to live the healthiest life possible. And I have seen so many people that will refuse to wear leather, and so they wear a plastic or some other synthetic, which is really very unhealthy. So to find out whether the 144,000 are going to be wearing leather, or whether they should be engaged in using leather, let's look at what the Bible has to say. So to begin with, we want to look at John, which is a type for the end of time. So John was an example to the people in these last days, to whom have been committed important solemn truths. God would have them temperate in all things. So certainly temperance in diet is part of being a member of the 144,000, it's a plant-based diet. We would have them see the necessity of the denial of appetite, for keeping their passions under the control of reason. This is necessary that they may have mental strength and clearness to discern between right and wrong, between truth and error. So we can see that we won't be able to discern between right and wrong, and that's the reason Spirit of Prophecy says that those that are preparing for the end of time, those that continue to eat flesh meats will depart from us. They will no longer be among those that are the remnant of God. So if we can't ask Jesus to help us get over the meat issue, we're not going to be among the 144,000. We're not going to be in heaven. There is a work for everyone to do in the vineyard of the Lord, and he would have them fit themselves to act a useful part. The heavenly messenger expressly enjoins upon the fathers to bring up their children with strict temperate habits. So many times we see the father as the one that acts intemperately. He's the one that eats the eggs every morning, fried in butter. He's the one that can't give up the meat. But fathers are to be the priests of the home. They are to be the spiritual leaders in health and temperance. John did not feel strong enough to stand the great pressures of temptation he would meet in mingling with society. He feared his character would be molded according to the prevailing customs of the Jews, and he chose to separate himself from the world and to make the wilderness his home. So far from being lonely, gloomy, or morose, he enjoyed his life of simplicity and retirement in his tempered habits, kept all his senses unperverted. We hear today the leadership of the church saying God doesn't call you to go hide out in the wilderness. He calls you to be in the world. Therefore, you must live in the cities to reach them, which is the absolute opposite to what Spirit of Prophecy says. She says that Lot suffered the consequences of living in the cities. He could have done everything he did in the cities if he'd lived outside of the cities. We also find that John the Baptist, a type of the end of time, which we're about to read, lived in isolation. God calls us to a life. He says that we are to hide ourselves, as it were, for a little moment until the indignation be overpassed. What time are we living in? Ever since 1844, we're under the third angel's message. We're under the third woe. We're to be living in isolation. Yes, we are to reach the cities, but we are to reach the cities as Noah reached them, with a message of warning, not by living in close proximity to them so that we will not be perverted. We need to fear, as John did, that we would be perverted by the society. And so we live in isolation so that we can draw closer to God. John accustomed himself to privation and hardship. We're not willing to do that. We're afraid to move out to the country because it might cause us privation and hardship, not understanding the spiritual blessings that are also associated with it. That he might be able to stand among the people as unmoved by circumstances as the rocks and mountains of the wilderness that had surrounded him for 30 years. A great work was to be done by him. It was necessary that he should form a character that would not be swerved from the right duty by any surrounding influence. The prophet John separated himself from his friends and kindred and made his home in the wilderness. Many times, in order to follow the cause of God, we're going to have to separate ourselves from friends and family. God has called us to the wilderness. He denied himself of the ordinary comforts of life. His food was simple. His clothing were made of garments made of hair cloth, confined from the waist with a leather girdle. So here we get the first hint. God did not ask his prophet not to wear a leather girdle because some animal died to give that leather girdle. He wore a leather girdle. Why? Because it was related to animal cruelty? No, because it was the highest quality material that would last a long time. We have been here when we first moved here. We were living in a tent, and our clothes would wear out very quickly. And I soon learned that if you're not going to buy and sell, you want the highest durability of clothing. And that highest durability of clothing is canvas and leather and nylon. These type of materials are the best. We also found out wool is also very good. We found out to begin with that the moths would eat all the wool, and I found a solution to that, and that is mixing nylon in with the wool. If you buy clothing that have a mixture of nylon and wool, then they are not become as appealing to the moths to eat. His parents had, in most solemn manner, dedicated him to God from his birth. So we're to dedicate our children from birth. We're to live in the wilderness, as John did. We are to practice his self-sustaining lifestyle if we are to truly follow God in these last days. inspiration, Ellen White was showing that the Waldenses, that they had suffered for their religion. The Waldenses are typologies also of the end of time and how we're to live. They were completely self-sufficient, and they conscientiously studied the Word of God and lived up to the light which is shown upon them. They were persecuted and driven from their homes. Their possessions gained by hard labor were taken from them, and their houses burned. They fled to the mountains, where they suffered incredible hardships. They endured hunger, fatigue, cold, and nakedness. The only clothing which many of them could obtain was the skins of animals, and yet scattered and homeless ones would assemble to unite their voices in singing and praise God, that they were accounted worthy to suffer for Christ's name. They encountered and cheered one another and were grateful for even their hunger. Yet the parents did not for a moment think of yielding their religion. They prized and loved the favor of God above earthly ease of worldly riches. They received consolation from God and from pleasing anticipations looked forward to the recompense of the reward. So we have a reward coming, and that's heaven, right? We should not be annoyed or discouraged by the hardships of a self-sustaining life. For in the hardships, there's blessing. In the hardship, there's spiritual character development. We have so many friends that believe they have to reach the city, so they're living. Evangelists that live within the city of Fort Lauderdale and preaches wonderful sermons about country living, but then says he's not practicing himself. He has a home out there, and he says, at least have a home out there where you can. God doesn't ask us to have a home in the wilderness we can flee to. He asked us to settle on the land. That's what Spirit of Prophecy says, to settle on the land. And if we don't settle on the land, we're not living the life that will prepare us to give the loud cry. Very interesting statement from Ellen White. There was a tanner who was in the area, and she gave him room and board. She calls him a hardy working man, and he worked in tanning leather, and she charged him a little bit of money to stay with him, and she gave him food to eat. And this is in 11th LTMS, LT 156, written in 1896. So Ellen White has no condemnation for his career as a tanner. In humility and in expressed sadness, Adam and Eve left the lovely garden where they had been so happy until they disobeyed the command of God. The atmosphere was changed. It was no longer unvaried as before the transgression. So there was no variation in temperature before sin. God clothed them with coats of skin to protect them from the sense of chilliness and then of heat of which they had been exposed. So what did he make that clothing of? It was made out of sheepskins, right? The sacrifice of the lamb, representing the sacrifice of Jesus. God himself made clothes for Adam and Eve. So if God made clothes himself out of animal skins, how could they be unhealthy? I don't think that's a logical conclusion. Nature, temperature, regulation, hypothermia, and odor-resistant properties, and superior physical protection against abrasion and weather. These are all the advantages of leather. Unlike synthetic fibers, it allows your skin to breathe while blocking the moisture and promoting overall comfort. Tan hides, often called traditional buckskin, offer significant health and physical benefits for clothing because they are 100% non-toxic, highly breathable, hypoallergenic, and natural insulating. They're highly porous. The brain tanning process removes stiff, round substances from the leather grain to the skin, leaving a highly porous fiber structure. And fabric naturally breathes and prevents trapping of sweat. No bacterial breeding ground because the leather does not trap moisture or perspiration against your skin. It reduces the risk of fungal or bacterial skin infection, common with synthetic or heavy finished commercial leathers. So I would say, as members of Amendment 44,000, especially in colder climates, we're going to need to use furs and leather. And let's not conform to the world and its customs. Let's use high quality. When we first got here, I would buy rubber boots, and they would wear out in a couple months. And then I got Danner leather and canvas boots. They lasted forever. So we are called as God's people to dress for the lifestyle that God has asked us to live.